Hello, this is Laura from Healing with Spirit, and I'm here actually with Lovern Gordon. We're talking about triggers in spiritual medicine. This is episode 2. And before I go in, I want to talk a little bit about what our mission is. So our mission is really to be a catalyst to show others how others basically a way to become the solution to breaking the cycle. Because what I see is the repetition and the epidemic of like all this unresolved, the perpetuation of unresolved, unhealed, unacknowledged trauma that just seems to keep cycling over and over again. So this is a kind of a new collaborative program that I'm trying to launch with industry experts, survivors, who have basically figured out the how to heal the effects of their the trauma, while breaking free from the chains that bound them in ways that society basically says it's not possible, right? So my mission, I'm a survivor. I'm a child survivor of child abuse. I used to say I lost my virginity not by my choice, but really and truly I was raped at 15. I dealt with sexual harassment in the workplace where I was fired from my first job after college because I asked my boss to keep his hands off of me, and leading to domestic violence. And now I'm kind of almost 20 years out. And I see this perpetuation. So my goal is like, how do we just stop breaking the cycle, right? I'm not quite seeing like there's broken things in everything we've been trying to do. But how do we take it a step further? So my mission is really to help others rediscover the power that lies within themselves and to find that treasure buried in the depths of what we call the shadows, right? And how do we take triggers, because triggers are always with us, whether we've been traumatized from abuse or racism or systemic oppression, all these different things. And how do we turn those triggers into a power versus a disempowerment? So I'm here with Lovern Gordon. I am so happy that you're here, Lovern. Just to give folks a little background on you, reading your bio, you just really amaze me because, and I like how you say you're a 2-time sur-THRIVER, not just a survivor, but a thriver of domestic violence. A child witness until she was 15 years old in a 2-year young adult relationship. 10 years after escaping, Lovern subsequently became the founder of the Love Life Now Foundation, where she used 2 back-to-back pageant wins to increase awareness around the issue in 2010. And the following year, Love Life Now Foundation was formed. Today, and I see you all over the place, where you are just, everybody wants to hear from you, Lovern. You are amazing, where you are really taking to heart the DV awareness workshops worldwide, and you host events that raise thousands of dollars to benefit DV shelters and points people into the right direction for DV resources. And I love this book. This book is amazing. She is the author of her memoir, The Legacy He Left Me, and has appeared on numerous radio and television shows, including CBS This Morning nationally and NBC's This Is New England locally. You've been featured in I could go on, like the Huffington Post, the Boston Voyager, Boston Celtics even just named you one of their heroes among us. And you were featured as part of the Instagram for Business Entrepreneur Together mini docuseries for Women's History Month. Welcome, Lovern.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate you. And gosh, yeah, to hear all those, I guess, things and places and all of the things, right, that come with, I guess, the accolades of doing the work. One would say, gosh, you can stop now. But there's no stopping, right? Really, I do this work from a heart of passion. And as you mentioned, I'm a 2-time sur-THRIVER, and it's a really sort of personal mission that I've been on. Not for the accolades, not for the shout outs or anything like that. It just has been sort of my personal life's journey to ever since I came upon this issue, realizing the impact that I could have, not just for, a big audience, but anybody that would listen. That's where it really started. And that's what it continues to be for me. It doesn't matter who we're talking with, or who I'm talking with. It can be an audience of one. I'm just happy to talk about this issue and get people in the know about the ways that they can be part of the solution via my own personal history with it. So thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah.
So can you, just for context, because really what I want to focus on is like the medicine piece, right? The spiritual medicine and the healing piece. But for context, can you kind of share briefly like your story?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, and you mentioned, I'm a two-time sur-THRIVER. I was a child witness to the issue for 15 years living on the island of Trinidad, where I watched our father brutally abuse our mother. And I completely, continuously said that that would never be me. I would never let anybody treat me the way he treated her. But unfortunately, children that grow up in those types of settings go on to become abusive themselves, and or victims. And I was no exception. I became a victim, a young adult from 21 to 23, where I experienced physical, emotional, and verbal abuse from the partner that claimed to love me, for about 2 years until I escaped. Finally leaving that situation, I thought, well, okay, I made the step to get safe, but it wasn't, right? And so, what happened was eventually, was tackled and attacked by him again. Because as we know, leaving is one of the most dangerous time for victims. And I finally followed through with a restraining order, but not before calling the police and getting them involved and all of that. But then, after getting the restraining order that finally kept him away, it wasn't until about 10 years later that I came to understand the layers of what this issue entails.
Mm.
After picking up a platform for a pageant that I had won locally and nationally. And, essentially, in picking up that platform, I got educated that year about what this issue really looks like for many people, what the terms were to marry to my personal history with the issue, why things were they were with the way they were, why I was suffering from PTSD, why I was this, why I thought this. And the following year, that's when I formed Love Life Now, the foundation that I run, and just wanting and hoping to get people educated about this issue from an awareness standpoint, and why we host initiatives to get people out and about, why there's so many different initiatives, why we do the workshops, why I share my story wherever I can. Just again, just taking a different approach to awareness and getting people involved in being part of the solution. So I hope that answers your question about sort of what the story is and what led me here.
Beautiful. We sometimes hear survivors, because if this happened to you when you were younger, and you were fortunate to get out while you were also still young. What would you say to survivors, or did you ever have, I should say, a moment where you didn't know if you could go on? Because I know I hear
Mm,
a lot from survivors like, I don't know if I can, I don't know if I have the strength or the stamina, especially with survivors that face what we call domestic violence by proxy, right? Where they
mm,
actually turn the system and they perpetuate patterns of abuse by using the system against them, right?
yeah,
And that's one of the things that actually happened to me was the use of the system. And so where you hear some of survivors and they go, I just can't do this anymore. I don't even want to be on the planet anymore because I just can't do this. Did you ever have any of those moments where you felt that? And how did you, what kind of helped you transform that?
yeah. And so that's a good question. And so that's what I like to call our breaking point as victims, when we're in the thick of things and we don't or cannot fathom what the next minute is going to be, because all you see is dread, all you see is despair, all you see is sadness, all you see is complete vulnerability to what could potentially happen next. And you know oftentimes we get to those points, and like you said, some survivors will sort of transform that into suicidal thoughts, because again, they cannot go on. And my heart breaks for those folks. My heart breaks for those families that have to go through that, right? But then sometimes you get to your breaking point, and it's because you're gonna try to figure out, okay, what's next? And that could mean either leaving in the middle of the night, leaving in the middle of the day. That can mean going to get help for yourself for the first time. Because oftentimes, I'll be quite frank, oftentimes we don't choose ourselves. Oftentimes we're thinking about what it could mean for your abusive partner, and if you get them in trouble, what that could mean for your children if you said anything, what that could mean for your family who is well-to-do, and you could potentially bring shame upon them if you disclose something like this, what that could mean for your husband's or your partner's career. All of these things is sort of what's at the forefront when you get to that breaking point. And then, like I said, it oftentimes can transform into suicidal thoughts because, if I leave, at least it'll stop, and then he'll have nobody to bang on. There are all of these things. I got to my breaking point and I decided to get help for myself. It didn't mean, at least in that moment, that I wanted to get him in trouble. What it meant for me was that I wanted the abuse to stop. I wanted to figure out what was happening to me, my body physically in that moment, because he had beaten me so bad. This was the worst of any of the beatings that he had given me. And it wasn't until a couple of hours later, laying in the bed next to him, that I realized, okay, Lovern, you can either stay here for him to finish the job when he wakes up, um, for him to, wake up and apologize and know that it's going to happen again because this is the pattern. Or you can get up and go get help for yourself. And I chose myself for the first time. And even in the ER, I didn't think that I was going to get him in trouble, that I wanted to get him locked up. I just wanted the abuse to stop. And so even talking to the triage nurses, it was the idea of, how can I come up with a really good lie that they'll believe, that they won't, first of all, they won't look at me sideways like, oh my God, look at her, she just got beat up. Who would let themselves go through that, right? Which is what I was running with for the whole relationship. And then
I even had,
furthermore,
I even had a lawyer that I had that said to me exactly that.
yeah,
How could a woman like you allow yourself to be abused? That was his statement to me.
exactly. Right. And so you had that said to you. Looking back, right, there are people that say to me now that the book is out, why didn't you say something? We would have helped you. But in your mind, you're like, that's the worst of anything that could happen if they found out, and you just don't want anybody knowing. So,
That's the
when
shame
the
piece,
ER,
right?
it's the absolute shame. And so when the ER doctor came in and said immediately, who did this to you? Because he knew, right? These injuries aren't consistent with you falling in the shower, right? So the ruse is up, right? You begin to fess up, but you don't want to get your abuser in trouble for whatever reason. There are many reasons, right? But for me, I didn't want the police attention. I didn't want people coming around my building asking questions. I didn't want to get booted out of my building because I'm bringing drama to the premises. I didn't want my job finding out. I didn't want my family finding out. I didn't want my school finding out why I was on my way to flunking my first year of college at Suffolk University. There was just no way. I had seen myself above who I thought was a victim. And for up until that point, that was my mother in real life. My mother was uneducated at the time she went through the abuse. My mother was financially dependent on our father. My mother could barely hold sort of a, sort of a worldly conversation with other folks. I was none of that, right? I didn't see myself as this person, even though I was getting physically, verbally, and emotionally abused. The same things that was happening to her. I still far removed myself because of my quote unquote little status that I had, right? And
Right.
sometimes that's what it is for a lot of folks, is that They don't see themselves as victims because they don't see themselves as who they saw or what they marry to what a victim is. So
Well, that
yeah,
happened to me. I
absolutely.
think of everything that ever happened to me, including when I was raped at 15. I
Mm,
just said I must have put myself in that place. Maybe I didn't say no strong enough. All these
yes.
different things. And I know, like, even with my divorce, and when I went for my first restraining order, I was actually more concerned. So it's interesting how you say, like, we don't see ourselves as a victim. I wasn't seeing myself as a victim. I too just wanted the abuse to stop. And it was
Yep.
on the encouragement of friends who saw the bruises on my body that
Uh,
said, you need to at least file a police report. And I said, no, I can't, because he has a securities license. I knew what that would mean.
yeah.
And I think I was more ashamed at being a statistic with divorce and a
Yeah.
failure than I was about the abuse. Like it was really bizarre how our minds think like that, right? And you just
Yes.
go, where does that even come from? Which brings, like,
Mhm.
the whole thing about shame, right? And I
Yep.
know when I've been doing a lot of work about where do we start self-shaming, where does that really rooted? And I know, and working with various folks, especially folks of color and indigenous communities and things like that, and understanding, like, the patriarchy and colonialization and the role of how that affects us, I started really taking stock into, even as a survivor, where it comes to even self-shaming. Like, we see a woman that's coming out of a bar, her clothes are tattered, right? Beaten and bruised. And we go, why was she there? Why was she
Right.
dressed like that? All
Right.
these things, right? Instead of
Yep.
looking at, well,
The
geez, who did
abuser and
this to
holding
you?
them accountable. Mhm.
Exactly.
Right.
So what is your experience? Like, what comes up for you when I talk about shame in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, again, I going through that issue because I had up until that point seen myself as a smart person. I thought that I had it together. I thought I was on my way to being so far removed from who my mother was. I wanted to be more like Claire Huxtable on TV. I wanted to be more like Blair Underwood from LA Law, if you remember that show. And all of these characters spoke strength, spoke power, right? The kind of thing that my father had, who was educated, who was articulate, who was the financial breadwinner, right? So even though he was this monster, I still respected and loved who he was as a individual sort of caretaker. That's the only way I can sort of word that. But as far as shame, growing up in the Caribbean, and for many I have to speak for Black communities, right? There is the ideology that, first of all, what happens here stays here, okay? Um, that you are responsible for, as a woman, I should say, as a woman, you are responsible for your well-being. You are responsible to grow up and be fit for a relationship. Okay, you are responsible to keep yourself groomed and tidy and neat and speak when you're spoken to and close your legs and don't say too much. Be submissive, and what you're, if there's something wrong in a relationship, you need to fix it. And when we talk about those things, a lot of those things really go across the board, but it is even more tapped into when you're growing up in a Caribbean home setting or any Black home setting, I would say. Because at that point, not only is the issue of domestic violence normalized, back then I should say it was completely normalized, because it's not just your house, it's every other house. And the question that society puts in those settings is, what did you do to make him mad? Did you cook the food right? Right? Did you screw up the laundry? Did you do something wrong with the money? You are responsible for what's happening to you in that sense. And it's a warped mentality.
Yes, it
But
is.
then you take it to a level of, clergy and people in the community where faith is a huge deal. Religious faith is such a huge deal. And even when you go to that extent, you're thinking about pastors who are saying, go home and work it out, or bring him to the church and let me talk to him, or let me come to your house and let me talk to him, and things are going to be okay. And not understanding back then, this is the 80s, right? Nobody has any resources that they can point you in the direction of. And even though there were shelters available, it was very little talked about it. And so when I hear people say, oh, well, this is such a bad issue these days, and I wish that we could do something to circumvent it, because back then it wasn't as prevalent. Yes, it was.
Yes, it was.
Okay. It is just that the mindsets of people were so far off from the truth that people, or our truth that we talk about now day to day, that patriarchy wasn't a thing, right? It was, back in the 50s where women, again, closed the doors, and it was, just be the perfect wife and do as you're supposed to do and keep the family together and make the lunches and cook the food. And over time, because the domestic violence movement grew and grew and grew, those mindsets started to shift because more awareness happened. And I think that's really the only difference between then and now, is because there was no awareness back then. So everything that happened to you, like I said, you were responsible for it. And if things went south, it's because you had to hold that shame. You had to hold that blame. Not realizing that the shame and the blame had nothing to do with you. And it was absolutely okay to give that shame back to who owned it. And that's abusers. And that's, I think, the difference now is that we're opening more up. We're opening up more to the conversation of what it means to hold abusers accountable and how we can be more inclusive of men being a part of the conversation, because that was not a thing before. That was not a thing in the 50s. That's not a man's. It's not a man's problem. It's a woman's problem. And if there's something, it's a husband and wife thing. If the police show up, you got to get yourself safe, right? So I think that's where the shame comes from. It's a societal thing in general, where gender stereotypes are completely harmful if we are shifting it in one way or the other, oftentimes for children. And that's where I think a lot of the cycle tends to repeat, because we're continuously telling girls, speak when you're spoken to, close your legs, be quiet, be fit for a man. This is the message that we're sending to our girls, oftentimes from very, very early on. So all their mindset is like, oh my God, I have to be the prettiest. I have to be, the most flawless. I have to dress a certain way, and I have to get the perfect man, and I have to get married. But nobody ever tells you what happens after that. You get the man, and all these pressures are put on girls to be
Cinderella, right?
And perform.
That's Cinderella right there.
And
right? Because
present.
it's about it's about getting your prince, turning your power over, letting him control you.
Right, but but nothing is ever spoken about after you and the prince get together. It's not happily ever after. There's a lot of in-betweens. Marriages and relationships are not perfect. But here's what, if you see these things in the beginning, nobody's talking about it. If you see these things in the beginning of the relationship, run for the hills. Don't stay with them, right? But we're being told, stick with your man, stick with your girlfriend, stick with your wife. And this is where the detriment and the cycle begins to repeat, because everybody's saying, it's for the long haul. That's what marriage is. And that's what relationships are, despite all the dangers and the pitfalls that it comes with. So it's really important to me in our work to continuously talk about those things, what the red flags are, what the pitfalls could be, what healthy relationships can and should look like. Hello, if they're bad relationships, well, oh my gosh, everybody thinks, well, everybody's supposed to know what the healthy relationship looks like. You're supposed to come home every day and hug your wife and tell her you love her. And no, there's a whole bunch of stuff in between that. Yeah, go ahead, Laura. Sorry, I can go on.
So I was gonna say, no, you're amazing. So I just know we're limited for time too. So I want to make sure we get some of these things, because that really even speaks to, I grew up in child abuse too, growing up in a broken home, and going and looking at some of these shame things, right? And being white, also coming from Irish, Germanic, Ukrainian, and Russian descent, I'm looking at like why, like we look at like how we appropriate things from indigenous cultures or other cultures, right? As white women type of thing.
Yeah.
And it really goes into things like the Inquisition, right? And to think, we can go right back into like the Institute of Marriage was originally a form of enslavement because the husband could get away with murdering you because you couldn't produce a male heir, right? And
Right.
all these different things. So I look at all the psychosocial things that have been passed on to us over and over. And then we got the witch trials, right? And women were actually encouraged, especially white women, were encouraged to actually hang out with their fellow sisters,
Mhm.
so for survival, so it goes into this whole
Yeah.
thing about, so I always look at like, well, where does this idea of self-shaming really come from? And when I started really looking at it, I'm like, oh wow, this isn't like new. We've been doing
Right.
this for like hundreds of
Absolutely.
years,
Absolutely.
and it's just not getting better, it's just looking differently, right?
Yes, it's and it, like you said, it's been dressed up differently and passed down generation after generation. Because if your grandmother, dealt with self-shame, your mother's gonna have some of that, then you're gonna have some of that. And again, it's dressed up differently, different time, different generation, but it is absolutely the same thing. And so
So
again,
this
the
brings
gender stereotypes. Go ahead.
So this brings me to like, we know this, right? So like I
Mhm.
know for myself and looking at this, it's like, well, then how do you know? And this goes into probably the spiritual medicine piece, right? It's like, how do you know, probably through your healing and all the things that you've done? Because it's like, how do you even know what love really looks like?
Right.
If you didn't really know what that, because who you had as models growing up,
Mhm.
how do you know what a healthy relationship looks like? How do you
Absolutely.
know that what you've been conditioned as to be objectified in your culture, right?
Mhm.
And how do you know that you're actually worth more than that? And
Yeah.
so it's like, how do you break that down for yourself? And through the healing and really kind of breaking that down to how you became who you are now, right? That's the
Yeah.
medicine piece.
Yeah, and that is another good question because again, we are not, if you're coming up in a home where abuse is prevalent or a broken home, you might not know if your dad was not present, right? Because he got locked up because of the abuse, or mom had to leave because of the abuse, right? You're growing up in a home where mom is strong and she has to be strong, and she may have different partners throughout the years because she can't recover from that, abuse. Or she may be with someone else who may be abusive again. And so you're seeing this pattern. And so all of these things play into who you become as an adult, right? And if none of it is positive, then you're stuck with, again, the idea of what love is, right? Which is completely unhealthy. It takes work to get up from under who you thought you were, what you believed love was. It all takes work. And for me, that journey looked like church. I kneeled very deeply into faith right after I left the abuse. And that, for me, gave me a sense of community that I had lost for almost 2 years. Not so much the religious part of it, but more so, like you said, the spiritual medicine. That sermon meant a lot to me every Sunday, that I could shift my mind away from self down and downing and self shame, because that's what it was right immediately after leaving. It wasn't like, oh my God, I left and now I'm great. No, it was
Right.
sense a loss of relationship, right? So here you thought you were going to be with this person for a long time, and it ended because you had to leave. It wasn't because you wanted to leave, but you had to make a step, and then you had to make another step, and then you had to make another step that put you in that leaving position. So sense of a loss of relationship, sense of community because I'd been isolated from family and friends, sense of loss of what I thought was love for a long time. There was a huge loss and big gaps to fill. So again, that sense of community for me opened me back up to being okay with being around other people. Then journaling was a big one for me. That putting my thoughts and feelings down on paper every day or every other day, that really helped me see how dark things were, but then how much lighter things began to get as I began to like go back in my journal to see, oh my God, this period was so gloom, but look, it's gotten brighter. And you know what? I just got to keep pushing, right? And I just got to keep positive affirming. So those two things. And then much later on, years later, therapy. I sought therapy for myself because I had met someone that gave me all green flags sprouting up in my system. And I kept doubting myself that, okay, Lovern, you're probably going to screw this up because of the feelings that I had still from what I had gone through in that relationship. And so I sought therapy to sort of deal with all the things that were still looming in my brain and heart. And that really helped push me over the edge into sort of that positive mindset. It helped me to understand that what happened to me wasn't because of me. It helped me to understand that the blame that I was holding for myself didn't belong with me. I needed to give that back. Um, and day by day, I continuously did that by one, forgiving this person for what they had done to me. I could no longer hold on to the level of anger that I had had against him because it only ate at me. I could no longer hold on to the sadness of what had happened to me, even though every time I talked about it, it made me feel emotional. I needed to let go of the sadness. I hope that makes sense. Like I was
Yeah.
still very much emotional because it put me back in a space every time I talked about it, of what happened in those moments and what I was feeling in those moments. But I was no longer sad that it had happened to me. And so it was quite the journey. It wasn't overnight. Some people might say you took part in a pageant. Well, I was dared to do that. It wasn't because I wanted to. I just wanted to
Okay.
prove my friends wrong that I could go through with this thing. It just so happened I ended up winning. It just so happened I ended up winning the next leg. But again, even as we talk about now, today, of who I am, writing the book, oh my gosh, that put me back in a headspace that I want nobody to ever be in, because it drug me back down to some details that I, again, thought I had dealt with the initial therapy, and had to realize that there was still more. And I am now in therapy every Wednesday. It is my self-care hour that I take for myself, and I sit and I vent and I talk with my therapist in Vermont via telehealth, just as you and I are talking. We have a good hour, a good powwow. I stop whatever I'm doing and I go there. So yeah, even now as I, written the book, it put me back in therapy, but not, I'm not so much more dealing with the book anymore. It's just a non-judgmental person that I can sound off with every Wednesday for an hour. So it's made me a better person having to go back and face those details. So when you talk about spiritual medicine, it's no one thing. It wasn't one thing for me. I think there were a plethora of things, between positive self-affirmations every day, between prayer specifically as it relates to church, because now I don't consider myself religious. I consider myself a spiritual believer. The therapy. Those three things are the top-notch tier for me when you talk about what spiritual uh, uh, healing has been for me.
You must have just read my mind, because I was going to ask you, give me three things that you can give survivors as far
Top
as
three.
spiritual medicine.
Top three. But not, my pieces are not gonna look like someone else's pieces,
Right.
because they may not be involved in church. They may not believe in prayer or any of that, right? But positive self-talk. Talk with yourself. If you believe in the universe, talk to the universe. If a walk every day is what you need, go out and talk to the trees if you have to. Speak to all that's positive and lively, and seek what gives you joy. It may not be a walk, maybe you're not a walker, maybe it's just taking a moment to just cut out the outside world and watch Netflix for an hour, your favorite
Right.
shows, right? Whatever that means, whether it's travel is another one of mine. That's probably number 4. I love exploring new places, and obviously I can't do that every day, but when I do, I really kneel into it. I don't have a rigorous schedule. I do have an itinerary, but I do, I want to go out and I want to meet new people. And maybe it's traveling to a different town, right? Where you live.
Right.
Oftentimes when we come up in, and we live in certain areas, we don't know we only know the neighborhoods that we have to go to work in and school and pick up the kids at school. Go venture out, right? So for Massachusetts, that might be the Cape. That might be, the North Shore in Revere or the beach there, or South, out west, and just visiting places that you typically wouldn't go. That could be something you locally do for staycations or just day trips. Whatever brings you joy, just find that and lean into it. It doesn't take a top thousands of dollars to do oftentimes.
Right.
It can be, like I said, again, just driving and getting out of your car and exploring. So
I think
whatever
I think
brings you
that's
joy.
I think that's important what you just said there too. And the other key is I always say we each one of us that are survivors, thrivers from abuse, we all process trauma differently.
Differently.
And the
Yeah.
key is knowing and building that relationship, what I would say, to the somatics and the body wisdom, because that's going to tell you how what your needs are and how what you need to be whole again, right?
Yeah.
And many, one of the top ways abusers like to abuse is financially. So yeah, it doesn't, we're not talking about having to go spend thousands of dollars somewhere.
Right.
It's like for me, going to Blue Hills, right? In
Yes.
Massachusetts, right? And communing in with the trees and grounding, because there is science there. It's called Shinrin Yoku, which is called forest bathing, which has been scientifically studied to reduce the adrenal stress that we feel,
Yes.
right?
And so I love that you say forest bathing. I recently became acclimated with that term when I'm married now, and my husband and I, we went to New Hampshire, and the sort of the welcome packet talked about forest bathing, and because we stayed in the woods in the cabin, and it's like, I was like, oh, this is a thing I didn't know. Okay, be one with the trees and take in and soak up nature, and just, oh gosh, it just was, not that I had a term to put to it. I've done it before. It just was like, oh, that's why I feel so good when I'm when I'm out here. That's why it feels so
Yeah,
good. Just even looking out at trees or nature and being one with it. It just does so much for your system. And again, it doesn't take a whole lot to again being guiding yourself toward healing. But certainly I always encourage folks on the therapy process, because that just adds and really amplifies what you've been through, and sort of puts names to the things and helps guide you to what could potentially be, and helps you deal with the now. All of the things, all of the stuff that we deal with. It doesn't even have to be that you've gone through abuse, or right. We all have stuff that we deal with, and
yeah.
it's just letting it out is so important. So whatever that means, and again, if it means that you can't afford therapy, go sit and forest bathe and talk with the trees. Let the trees
Yeah,
have it, right? Let
yeah.
them have it. But whatever it is, let it out, because holding on to that, things, especially that are not yours, is really detrimental to your health. And that's the last thing you want to do.
And I want to just say, just the forest bathing might kind of seem a little woo-woo-ish, right? But
Yeah.
there is actually a lot of science, especially now that we're dealing with Wi-Fi. And just with take the trauma piece out, just with Wi-Fi, computers, cell phones have
Yes.
actually increased cellular stress on our physical bodies.
Yeah.
And there's science to actually show that by going into nature actually helps mitigate that.
Yes.
So, then we add the trauma piece, and it's just another layer of why to do it.
Right.
But
Exactly.
there's so
And
much
and I,
science behind that.
I agree. And again, go let the trees have it.
Yep.
Your tears, your thoughts, your anger, your shame. Again, that has nothing to do with you, and it's all supposed to be given back to the person that, you know, caused you this harm. Go let the trees have it. Take a walk and talk to yourself. People might look at you like you're going nuts, but guess what? You're freeing yourself. And if nothing, again, if you're not a walker, go sit in a corner and cry it out. Let it out. I mean, one of our posts recently was, sometimes that's what resilience looks like, is taking time to just bawl your eyes out. And I certainly have done that. You look at me and you see, oh, she's doing this and she's doing that, and she's been on CBS and she does this and she travels into. No, I have had times where I just sit and bawl my eyes out. And it's not necessarily anything to do with my now relationship. I just sometimes think about the past and the trauma, and that's overwhelming sometimes for me. Even today, PTSD affects me in more ways than one. And sometimes I just have to bawl my eyes out. Sometimes in the
And that's such a
shower.
gift.
It's
That's
a
a gift.
gift to let it
You don't
out.
realize that it's when you cry, it's actually a physical release. You're releasing part of that story. You're allowing yourself to
Yes.
process. You're releasing all that stuff that maybe we buried inside of ourselves for
Yes.
umpteen years because we
Let it
had
out.
to survive and we never got a
Yes.
chance to process. We forget
Yes.
that trauma is more than just all the emotional stuff that we've been talking about. It's actually
Mhm.
embedded in the cellular DNA. So when we
Yes.
cry, it's actually a great, beautiful gift that we can give ourselves. I mean, I grew up in a house where you cry, you're a sissy, you're a baby, right? So it's
Yes.
like, you know,
And it's
stop
even
that.
worse for our boys, right? Again, going back to gender stereotypes from very early on. Boys are taught to just be. Go out and be a boy. Just be. But you know what? Don't cry. Don't ever let me see you crying. You better toughen up, right? You scraped your knee, toughen up.
Right, right.
She hit you, toughen up. Go hit her back, right? And so all
Yes.
these things, right? And then the girls, if a boy hits you on the playground, he likes you, right? So
Like,
it's just such a, like, what the hell are we telling our kids from way early on that then gets them these mindsets that when they get into college, look, if a girl doesn't want to give it up, take it.
yeah, we did the first
Demand your
episode we did.
respect.
Yeah, the first
Demand
episode
your
we did.
respect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
First
So,
episode we did was on basically the bystander role and
yes.
actually teen sexual abuse because we may do things because again it's our culture and we
Yes.
don't even realize how we're perpetuating the problem instead of being
Mhm.
part of the solution, right?
Yep.
So we're getting ready to wrap things up. What would be one lasting thing you would want survivors to know, especially when it comes to the spiritual medicine piece? Somebody that might be struggling right now, that what's that lasting thing you really want them to know?
That it's not your blame to carry. I think that's when we come to that realization, it's a game changer. But then what do you do with that when you understand that that's not what it is? And it's really hard to get up from under that mindset. It may take years of therapy. It took a year for me, right? But for someone else, if you are sitting in that shame, um, believing that, one, there's nothing else better for you on the other side, that's a lie. Believing uh, that you don't deserve love because of what's happened to you, that's a lie. Um, what I will say is that when you come to that realization and you're even just a smidgen open to the possibility of what could be, start figuring out what self-love is. I think that's one of the next biggest things that I can impart on folks, is that when we leave these relationships, we're immediately thinking about, what have I done? What's next? Then what's next is daunting and it's scary. Start figuring out what self-love can look like, and that can come with the help with a domestic violence advocate. So I urge you that if you're again in this situation, whether you're thinking about leaving, whether you've just left, whether you've left many years, think about getting connected with a DV advocate, domestic violence advocate in your area, to start to unpiece what you're thinking in your head, because if it stays here, then it goes nowhere. But if you voice it, right? Abusers prey upon our silence. And once we start talking and speaking up, that's when their power and control starts to be dismantled. So again, if you're thinking about leaving, talk to a DV advocate. They can help you figure out what's next in terms of safety planning. If you've left and you're still trying to figure out, gosh, where do I go from here? Talk with a DV advocate about what's happened and how that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with them, and what could potentially be next and how they can help you. If you're far removed from the situation, still talk to a DV advocate and get into counseling. All of the services are free throughout all these DV agencies. So if it's the last thing that I do on this talk with you, Laura, is impart on people that's part of getting to self-love, is getting connected with a DV advocate so that they can help you figure out what's next in your journey.
And
Ah,
where's the best way they can find you? Where's the
gosh,
best
I
way
love
they can
that.
find you?
So if you want to hold that up again, I'd love to get a shot of it, Laura. Love it. And folks can get the book anywhere that books are sold. It's at Walmart, it's on Amazon, it's Barnes and Noble. It's called The Legacy He Left Me, and you can get it directly at thelegacyheleftme.com. And you can find out about the foundation, Love Life Now, at www.LOVELIFENOW.org, lovelifenow.org. So thank
Beautiful.
you.
And I just want to add that, for me too, finding when it comes to therapy, make sure that they are trauma informed and trauma trained, because not
Yes,
all therapists
it's
know
not.
how to help survivors of abuse who have been
Yes,
traumatized. They don't have the skill
yes,
sets. Also, alternative therapies, same thing. Make
yes.
sure that you find, because I've seen a lot of perpetuation of trauma unknowingly by well-intentioned therapists
Sure.
and
Yeah,
well-intentioned healers, who don't really have the skill set. So I just want to end with that too. There are
absolutely
wonderful healers and therapists, but make sure that they actually have the other skill sets that are
necessary.
necessary to be able to help you with the trauma piece, because it takes a special skill set. All right. Thank you so much, Lovern, for being
Thank
here.
you.
And I will be posting links for anybody else in in the descriptions, the links on the web pages and everything else, wherever it's going to be posted, YouTube as well. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.